During the summer of 2020, police, federal troops, and the National Guard flooded the streets of American cities with a frequency and intensity the nation had not witnessed since the long, hot summers of the 1960s. After hundreds of people took to the streets to protest the murder of a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd by white police officer Derek Chauvin on May 25, 2020, police dressed in riot gear responded to a peaceful protest on May 26th by firing tear gas and rubber bullets into hundreds of demonstrators. Some of the protesters responded with violence of their own, breaking the windows of a police precinct and eventually burning it down. As the situation escalated, and as the video of Floyd's horrific killing became widely distributed across social media platforms and major news outlets, the National Guard assisted local police in tear-gassing crowds. From there, the protest and the state-sanctioned violence spread to St. Louis, Memphis, Louisville, and other urban centers across the United States. On May 29th, President Donald Trump took to Twitter, as he so often did to blow off steam during his tenure in the White House. "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," the president wrote. Knowingly or not, Trump had quoted word for word Miami Police Chief Walter Headley's response to the city's unrest in 1967. From Headley to Trump and in between, officials and much of the American public have widely assumed that police violence primarily occurs as a reaction to community provocation. The myth holds that the fires and the looting of the immediate post-civil rights period, and in our own time, began with disaffected groups themselves. The police were merely doing their jobs in reacting to a dangerous situation with force. As Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton put it in a New York Times op-ed that ran at the peak of the nationwide protest on June 3, 2020, it was the rioters in Minneapolis and other cities who plunged many American cities into anarchy. Police officers bore the brunt of the violence and, in Cotton's telling, were the victims of bands of miscreants. Ignoring the reality that the vast majority of the protest remained nonviolent, Cotton urged law enforcement to crack down. "One thing above all else will restore order to our streets," he argued, "an overwhelming show of force to disperse, detain, and ultimately deter lawbreakers." Contrary to the fear-mongering rhetoric of politicians, history reveals that police violence very often inflamed community violence, not the other way around. Although protesters are often blamed for creating violent situations where the police are forced to respond in kind, from Miami in 1967 to the George Floyd uprisings in 2020, law enforcement officials were the instigators. Indeed, protests have grown more peaceful since the fiery post-civil rights era, but the police response to them has escalated in its violence. Dominant narratives have confused where the responsibility lies, in part because of the police's increased reliance on tear gas and other chemical weapons that tend to be regarded as relatively benign riot control tactics. What happened during Labor Day weekend in St. Paul, Minnesota, in 1968 is one striking example. After hundreds of young black people in their teens and early 20s gathered downtown at a community dance, the preemptive application of force, in this case tear gas, on the part of the police brought what should have been a fun event to a violent end. The young partygoers had ventured 2 miles from the segregated Rondo neighborhood to Stem Hall, where local funk bands, the Exciters and the Blazers, were playing that Friday night. In anticipation, the attendees had selected cute, freshly pressed outfits to wear and had fixed their hair. Some of them hoped to dance with their crush or even get past first base. The youths weren't there to protest anything, by violent or nonviolent means, but to enjoy themselves. By 10 p.m., a crowd of 500 had arrived to hear the bands and move their bodies, and one group of friends, all young men, left the dance floor and headed to the restroom in Stem Hall's basement, where they could hang out away from everyone else. 2 cops followed the group downstairs. The officers were white and they stood out. Although the policemen were off duty and not in uniform, they came to Stem Hall with their guns and their radios just in case anything suspicious happened. The officers walked into the restroom, ready for trouble, just as one of the teens they followed pulled a pistol from his jeans to show his friends. In no time, the officers moved in to make an arrest, but they were easily outnumbered, and the young men began to yell in protest, hoping to keep their friend from being carted off to jail. Surrounded among the urinals, the officers called for backup, drawing their guns to hold the teens off. A scuffle ensued, ending with a shot to the shoulder of one of the officers. Reinforcements arrived at the scene around 10:30 p.m. The partygoers, dancing upstairs, were unaware of the standoff taking place below or that anything out of the ordinary was happening until tear gas suddenly came pouring into the hall. It was difficult to see. People's eyes started to tear, their nostrils burned, their throats became clogged as if they were being choked. They coughed as their chests tightened, but it was impossible to find relief. Police had trapped them in the Stem Hall with the gas, using their nightsticks to lock the doors. Only after all the on-duty police in St. Paul arrived, 150 officers total, plus 5 reinforcement squads from the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, did the police open Stem Hall. The youths, anxious and traumatized, poured into the streets to breathe in fresh air. The first thing they saw was the fleet of law enforcement ready and waiting to make arrests, or worse. Tensions between St. Paul's black residents and the mostly white police department, with only 4 black officers among its rank and file, were already high. The city had been on alert since the uprising in nearby Minneapolis during the previous summer of 1967, when an officer threw 2 black teenage girls to the ground during an altercation at the city's Aquatennial Torchlight Parade, and hundreds of black residents mobilized to hold the officers accountable. After the police arrived at the protest and a cop hit a pregnant woman's belly, residents fought back. They hurled rocks at police and Molotov cocktails at buildings. The National Guard and state troopers assisted local police in bringing the violence to an end after 4 nights. Similar incidents of police brutality or aggressive enforcement had ignited some 2,239 rebellions across the United States from 1964 to 1972. This era of political violence began with Harlem in July 1964, after a New York City police officer shot and killed a 15-year-old black high school student named James Powell. The community burned for 6 consecutive nights, with the fire spreading to Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood. 2 days after calm was restored in New York City, black residents in upstate Rochester threw rocks, bricks, and Molotov cocktails at police following the arrest of a 20-year-old black man for disorderly conduct at a block party. Lasting for several days, the violence came to an end only after Governor Nelson Rockefeller summoned between 800 and 1,000 National Guardsmen. Black residents in Chicago's Dixmoor suburb and Philadelphia rebelled the following month, although these incidents were subdued by comparison. In total, more than 2,000 people were arrested. 7 died and thousands were injured that July and August. The fires through the summer of 1964 had prompted President Lyndon Johnson to declare the War on Crime in March 1965, an effort that began an unprecedented federal investment in law enforcement. The federal allocation for local police forces went from nothing in 1964 to $10 million in 1965. $20.6 million in 1966, $63 million in 1968, $100 million in 1969, and $300 million in 1970. A 2,900% increase in 5 years. These funds enabled the twinned expansion and militarization of police in targeted low-income communities of color. The size of the police force in America more than doubled during this early stage of the crime war as federal policymakers delivered surplus Army weapons and technologies, including riot and crowd control training, military-grade weapons such as AR-15s and M4 carbines, steel helmets, armored vehicles, two-way radios, 3-foot batons, bulletproof vests, and tear gas to local departments. Despite these measures, the collective violence only escalated for the remainder of the decade and into the 1970s. Black residents in thousands of communities across the United States were fighting back against more than just the police officers who interrupted them or brutalized them as they went about their everyday lives. Although the tactics may have differed, the people who attacked police, smashed windows, set fires, and plundered local stores shared the same demands as the mainstream civil rights movement. They were fighting against the process of their own criminalization, as well as making unanswered calls for socioeconomic inclusion and against racism more broadly. As a group of teenagers who participated in a 1970 rebellion in Akron, Ohio, clearly explained to Mayor John Ballard, the causes of the collective violence were routine police harassment, the dearth of resources available to black residents, 200 years of repression and frustration from the white man, and unemployment. Everybody's been turned down this summer for employment, one of the teens said. Instead of addressing lack of access to decent jobs, housing, educational opportunities, and other drivers of inequality with a structural transformation that surpassed the self-help and training programs of the War on Poverty, the Johnson administration and Congress believe that increasing police patrols and granting weapons arsenals to police departments under the banner of the War on Crime would function as the most powerful deterrent to disorder in the short term. As such, police were deployed in neighborhoods with high rates of reported crime that seemed vulnerable to rebellion in anticipation of future violence. Rather than responding to incidents that had already occurred, as is the general police function in middle-class and white areas, in low-income communities of color, police were tasked with identifying a group that the Johnson administration and Congress called potential delinquents or potential criminals, and arresting them before they went on to cause trouble or harm. This preemptive strategy explains why the plainclothes officers were surveilling the dance at Stem Hall in the first place, with their guns and their radios. When the young people came pouring out of Stem Hall that Friday night, the police instructed all attendees to disperse and go home. Most followed orders, but about 150 remained, a match for the police force. The night had ended much earlier than expected, and the teenagers were just getting going. Their rides home had yet to arrive. Many of the concert-goers wondered where to go next, what to do. And many of them were angry, having just been violently tear-gassed out of nowhere and for no apparent reason. The gas affected the crowd indiscriminately, the local chapter of the Urban Coalition later observed in a report. It is clear that from the time the gas was thrown into the hall, a wider disturbance was beyond prevention. This cycle of over-policing and community rebellion was not unique to St. Paul. It played out frequently through the early years of the War on Crime. Just 3 weeks before the incident at Stem Hall, a fight between two attendees at a dance held at Washington Park High School in Racine, Wisconsin, led to police tear-gassing a crowd of 250 black teenagers. The youths proceeded to move through the streets of the black neighborhood in the south side of the city, smashing store windows, stoning cars, and setting fires, much as their counterparts did in St. Paul. In Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, a peaceful protest against police brutality in June 1969 quickly turned into a rebellion lasting for several days after police tear-gassed an angry crowd. The violence ended only after a black high school student was shot and killed by a local policeman who claimed the teenager was preparing to ignite a Molotov cocktail. As in Racine and Harrisburg, the decision on the part of St. Paul police to throw gas grenades at a grouping of residents created violence even if the purpose was to prevent it before it began. Some of the teens began hurling bricks, bottles, rocks, and even chairs at the police outside Stem Hall. They taunted them. After a rock hit an officer in the head, causing him to fall to the ground, the police felt they had to move in and break up the crowd by force. The youths quickly split up, running in two opposite directions. The police followed their lead, separating to pursue both groups as the teens made their way back to their small, often deteriorating homes, smashing the windows of white-owned businesses, breaking into cars and stores, assaulting white civilians, and pulling fire alarms along the way. At the time, the conditions in the city's Rondo community, home to 85% of St. Paul's black residents, clearly resembled those of Harlem, Watts, Detroit, and other low-income black communities across the United States that had also erupted. With just over 300,000 residents, the black population in St. Paul had surged 35% as Southern migrants fled the terror of Jim Crow in the 2 decades leading up to the uprising. As the flood of newcomers settled in the Rondo neighborhood through the 1950s and early 1960s, and in part to make way for the construction of Interstate 94, a total of more than 1,000 units in the area had been demolished, causing a severe shortage of low-income housing that provided tenants with standard or even decent conditions. As St. Paul became a blacker city, middle-class white residents moved to modern, more comfortable housing at affordable prices in the suburbs. Black residents were essentially limited to segregated projects, where the housing authority was unresponsive or often insensitive, or to the oldest housing stock in the city, where slum landlords who were very rarely subject to housing inspections allowed the dwellings to deteriorate further while charging exorbitant rents. Urban renewal policies and neglect left the already vulnerable Rondo district vastly overcrowded. Adding to these desperate conditions, black residents paid more for decrepit homes in St. Paul and many other cities at the same time as they suffered from a rate of unemployment that was more than 3 times that of their white counterparts, and those with jobs were most often in the lowest-paying, unskilled sector. As a result, 26% of black residents in St. Paul lived below the poverty line, more than double the rate of white households in the city. Although craft trades and apprenticeship programs had recently opened up to black residents, affirmative action measures had made very minor changes in the overall situation. And the public schools, which that state had flagged as racially imbalanced for the segregation within them, were becoming increasingly punitive for black students, who were frequently suspended and who dropped out at disparate rates. In effect, by holding a group of young people at gunpoint and then unnecessarily tear-gassing several hundred more, the St. Paul police force set the violent cycle in motion that escalated as the night went on. A total of 22 policemen were injured during the unrest, all of whom recovered quickly, including officers who suffered gunshot wounds, and 30 residents suffered physical harm at the hands of police. 20-year-old Taretha Glass Kelly was one such victim. Glass Kelly came to Stem Hall with her sister, and they sprinted off together when it seemed an attack by police was imminent. Glass Kelly was 6 months into her pregnancy at the time and struggled to keep up. Her stomach started cramping, and the tear gas still lingering in her lungs didn't help. An officer discovered Glass Kelly as she stopped to catch her breath near the local library, her belly protruding from the dress she had carefully selected for the evening. He struck the young girl with his riot stick, causing her to fall to the ground. He continued to kick her in the stomach and pull her hair before eventually moving on to hunt others in the dead of night. Glass Kelly made her way to the hospital with the assistance of a policeman who treated her far more kindly than the first officer. Her baby was fine, and she suffered only bruises, and by 4 a.m., the uprising had seemed to subside. But residents prepared for retaliation the following night, making Molotov cocktails and throwing them at 3 white-owned businesses in the Rondo neighborhood just before 9 p.m. When firefighters arrived to extinguish the blaze, they were reportedly hit by sniper fire. Officers, too, were shot at as they patrolled the neighborhood, seeking to prevent additional destruction. For the most part, however, property damage was light, as reporters described it, confined mostly to broken windows. A total of 26 young black people were sitting in jail by that point, the vast majority on charges of unlawful assembly, others for aggravated assault and gun possession. Once peace had been restored in St. Paul on Sunday, September 1st, the local Urban Coalition and Human Rights Department commissioned studies to determine the causes of the rebellion. Together, they interviewed hundreds of witnesses and residents throughout the fall and released their reports in February 1969. The tensions and frustrations of the St. Paul Negro community have been created by so many factors and been bottled up so long that disorder seemed inevitable. Human Rights Department Director Louis H. Irvin wrote, "Something had to give." The investigators identified the crisis in housing, employment, and education as the fundamental causes of the violence. But their recommendations to remedy these inequalities, regulating slum landlords, constructing new affordable housing units, desegregating public schools, and creating jobs, never came to fruition. And although the Human Rights Department criticized some ineptitude, even misconduct, among local police, it ought not to and will not detract from the exemplary conduct on the part of the officers who consistently maintained discipline during the rebellion. Ultimately, the Human Rights Department defended the use of force against hundreds of innocent teenagers in Stem Hall that evening. Even if authorities consistently upheld the fundamental logics of policing in targeted neighborhoods, the fact that law enforcement very often inflamed community violence did not entirely escape policymakers and law enforcement officials. The widely distributed 1967 FBI manual called Prevention and Control of Mobs and Riots recognized that the application of force was a delicate matter, for its premature use would only contribute to the danger, aggravate the mob, and instill in the individual a deep-rooted hatred of police. Likewise, in its 1969 report, the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence concluded that excessive force is an unwise tactic for handling disorder that often has the effect of magnifying turmoil, not diminishing it. When riot control methods came in for criticism as rebellions flared through the summers of Johnson's presidency, tear gas offered a solution. Officials regarded the chemical as a measured response to domestic political violence, a way to control crowds without resorting to outright brutality. A combined total of some 80 black residents had been killed by police, National Guardsmen, or paratroopers during the 1965 Watts Uprising and in the 1967 Newark and Detroit uprisings. Equipping civil police with automatic rifles, machine guns, and other weapons of massive and indiscriminate lethality is not warranted by evidence, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known popularly as the Kerner Commission, wrote in its 1968 report. Weapons which are designed to destroy, not to control, have no place in densely populated urban communities. However, the Commission and federal policymakers across the political spectrum determined that tear gas provided police forces with an effective and appropriate weapon that could quickly disperse a mob without resorting to beating people with billy clubs or shooting them with bullets, and was essentially harmless beyond its immediate effects. It is now understood that tear gas, in any form, can cause significant damage to the lungs, liver, and heart. The chemicals that tear gas contains are so powerful that pregnant women who have been exposed to chlorobenzylidine malononitrile, CS fumes, are vulnerable to miscarriage. The tear gas that the St. Paul Police Department unleashed on the dancing teenagers and that thousands of other departments frequently used on the streets of American cities in the late 1960s and early 1970s had been initially formulated toward the end of World War I. Then, military officials used the non-lethal chloroacetophenone, CN, gas to move people from trenches and force enemies into retreat. Tear gas had been banned under international law in 1925, but the United States and many other nations consistently relied on it as a weapon of domestic law enforcement and a riot control measure for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The British developed the more potent OCS, or super tear gas, in the 1950s to put down uprisings in its colonies. The weapon proved to be useful in inflicting both physical and psychological torture on those who might challenge the empire. The United States quickly adapted its own version for use, viewing tear gas as an effective way to leave riotous crowds demoralized, stomping the collective spirit of the protest, or gathering and preventing participants from engaging in further action, at least temporarily. Yet it was not until the 1960s, in the context of the Vietnam War and the launch of the War on Crime at Home, that tear gas became popular among U.S. military and law enforcement officials. The more pronounced impact of CS gas, in particular, proved effective in pursuing the Viet Cong through underground bunkers and tunnels, and in putting down so-called riots in Black American neighborhoods from St. Paul to Los Angeles. Tear gas had been intended for the battlefield, to harm enemy forces for a brief period of time without leaving a trail of blood. The chemical weapon produced immediate effects, attacking the senses of its intended targets, leaving them incapacitated anywhere from 10 seconds to 10 minutes, and causing, as the Army Manual Military Chemistry and Chemical Agents described it, and as the young people in STEM Hall experienced it, extreme burning of the eyes, accompanied by copious flow of tears, coughing, difficulty in breathing, and chest tightness, involuntary closing of the eyes, stinging sensations of moist skin, running nose, and dizziness or swimming of the head. Following the Kerner Commission's best-selling 1968 report, tear gas became the weapon of choice to suppress both non-violent and violent protests for racial justice, or, as the story of St. Paul shows us, simply controlling crowds in Black communities that seemed prone to both rioting and crime. Of course, tear gas had been used during civil rights protests, such as the planned 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in March 1965, after police killed 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson during a peaceful voting rights demonstration. As 600 marchers proceeded on Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers, sporting gas masks, shot 40 canisters of tear gas into the crowds, 12 canisters of smoke, and 8 canisters of nausea gas, and then they proceeded to beat the marchers with clubs and whips under the smokescreen of the chemicals in an incident remembered as Bloody Sunday. This was only the beginning of what would come in the era of Black power and Black rebellion. Police, state troopers, and National Guardsmen used the chemical to punish protesters for challenging the racial status quo as much as for its stated purpose of quelling disturbances. By 1969, tear gas had become so ubiquitous that the Department of Justice had enabled the low-cost sale of more than 70,000 gas masks to local law enforcement. Tear gas remained an essential riot control device through the collective violence that rocked Miami in 1980, Los Angeles in 1992, Cincinnati in 2001, and in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore in the mid-2010s. The 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention upheld the international prohibition on tear gas and other chemical weapons in warfare, but they are still regarded as humane alternatives to violently arresting or shooting into crowds of people, and law enforcement officials around the world are still permitted to apply the devices at their discretion. For the most part, the composition of CS gas hasn't changed from the formula developed in the 1950s. But the canisters that contain the weapon have become more advanced and powerful, and therefore more destructive on impact. A host of other projectiles that have been developed in recent decades, such as rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, and stun grenades, are likewise often misused against protesters and can cause debilitating injuries and permanent disabilities. During the largest social movement in American history, sustained by tens of millions of protesters through the summer of 2020, law enforcement in at least 100 cities discharged tear gas and other non-lethal weapons. The demonstrations in Minneapolis in the days after George Floyd's murder were the opening act, when the National Guard hurled tear gas canisters to disrupt the protest, like a knife cutting butter, in the words of President Trump, an action that produced a beautiful scene. One of the most egregious incidents of that summer involved U.S. Park Police and Secret Service agents who used tear gas, riot batons, and other weapons against non-violent protesters in Lafayette Square near the White House to make way for a photo opportunity for Trump in front of the nearby St. John's Church. From Sacramento to Providence, the fog of tear gas dominated the police response to unanswered calls for social justice and racial equality once again. Yet, unlike the earlier rebellions, which typically began with demonstrators throwing rocks, bottles, and other objects when police arrived to patrol their communities, or when police used tear gas and other forms of blatant violence preemptively, as in St. Paul, the demonstrations from Ferguson onward started as peaceful marches and vigils in response to flagrant acts of brutality. When police responded aggressively to these nonviolent protesters, some of them quickly turned violent, and so the cycle began. The tear gas used in St. Paul in 1968 and in Minneapolis and Washington more recently is part of the recurring pattern of police violence and community violence that took hold roughly a half-century ago and has remained unbroken. The history of protest, past and present, demonstrates that aggressive policing tends to incite violence, especially when residents are protesting the very thing to which they are then subjected. Because police force is almost always viewed as legitimate, tear gas and other forms of state-sanctioned violence will remain the go-to short-term solution that policymakers and officials embrace whenever people challenge racial hierarchies and the systems that uphold them. The long-term solution that will finally break the cycle involves dismantling the underlying socioeconomic drivers of inequality that extend far beyond a single law enforcement agency. Until then, nonviolent and violent protesters alike will continue to be harmed when toxic substances are used against them, and all of us will continue to live with the violent legacies of American racism and the myths that sustain it.